And they're given marching orders to do that. That's the sad part of it. If all these boundaries would have been structured the way they are today, because of the independent committees' recommendations, their recommendations, not gerrymandering from government, that would have been acceptable. The point is, the government gerrymandered with this thing. They fooled around with it with the intention of political gain, and there's no other way to describe it. So if that's what's happening now, we see this party over there that used to be so righteous when they stood on this side of the House, and they were so proper, and everything was great, and they were going to fix everything in the world, and all of a sudden they get to government, and all that changes. All of it changes. And you know, it makes you wonder how they can do this to Nova Scotia and the people of Nova Scotia. You know, you just go in. This gerrymandering with the boundaries is something like you would hear in a third world country where a dictator runs what goes on. Not much different. It's not much different. You've got, the only difference is we have the media here, and that sort of hold people accountable for what they do, and that's a good thing they do. But this whole thing, as it's transpired, is a disgrace to the political process in Nova Scotia. It's an absolute disgrace. And until we hear what the final bill is going to be like, dear knows what that's going to be. Maybe I would say that they're probably going to have to save the seat in Shelburne. They're probably going to have to save some other seats. I don't know what they're going to tell or how they're going to do the amendments in this whole process to save some of their elected members, so hopefully they think they can get back to government. I don't know if that'll ever happen. There's so many upset people in this province with this government today. It's a pretty slim chance that they'll win election again. And for our financial health in this province, I certainly hope they never get reelected again. So, you know, and that's what I'm hearing everywhere. And when we go see what they have done and how they've gone about it, it's simply unbelievable. You ready? You know, this is very upsetting. Okay. Well, we see it's very upsetting with what's happened to the people in the province. And next thing you know, they're going to decide, if they stay in power long enough and they get arrogant enough, they're going to finally say, well, we don't need elections anymore. We'll just have a vote in the legislature, put ourselves back in for another 5 or 6 years. And, you know, they're not far from that by the way they've gerrymandered with the process. So, you know, I wasn't going to speak on this bill to start, but after I've heard so many complaints from so many people about how this was organized, how it was done, how everything was switched around and changed around to make it better for this party to try to get 2 more seats in Metro where they hold most of the seats, where they figure they might get 1 or 2 of these seats and eliminate a couple more outside out in the rural areas. Well, if I was sitting in rural Nova Scotia, I'd be very upset. People in Metro are very upset about this whole process. Well, Madam Speaker, it's no good talking about this anymore because this government doesn't listen anyway. They're not going to change anything. They're not going to do what they figure that they might be their best political advantage. And with those, and the people of Nova Scotia will judge them at the end of the day, and it's going to be a harsh judgment when it comes. I can guarantee you it's going to be a harsh judgment. And I'm glad that I'm not sitting on that side of the House when that happens. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am very pleased to rise today and talk about what has clearly become the boondoggle of all boondoggles for the NDP when it comes to redrawing our electoral boundaries. I don't intend to speak long. I've heard many eloquent words from members on this side of the House about how this process has gone so horribly wrong. But I do want to just add a few specifics, Madam Speaker. After all, this has been going on for a year now. In fact, it was on October 31st, exactly a year ago yesterday, when this House met on Halloween night, that the government brought in the original resolution to start the boundary redrawing process as it is required to do by law. Madam Speaker, at that time the resolution was to form a select committee of this legislature to write up the terms of reference. The terms of reference were not available at that time. They were to be written up later by the Select Committee. Madam Speaker, many members were led to believe that the terms of reference would be the same as, or very close to the same as, the terms of reference of all previous electoral boundaries commissions. We found out later, of course, that that wasn't the case, but I remember very clearly that night, Madam Speaker, that members looked at a resolution from the government side to set up a Select Committee of the House on the understanding that it would be dealing with terms of reference similar to those of past years. Madam Speaker, there was an opportunity at that time to not draw the boundaries in the same old way, but to make an improvement to the boundary setting process by rejecting the old way of having the governing party dominate the committee that writes the terms of reference and make all three parties equal partners in the writing of the terms of reference for the independent commission. To me, Madam Speaker, that was a matter of common sense, that when it comes to something as important and nonpartisan as the boundaries of our electoral districts, when it comes to something as important as basically the rules of the game for the next election, that Nova Scotians would apply an important test of fairness. And that test of fairness would include that all of the three parties participating in those elections are equally represented on the committee that sets the rules of the game. That was an improvement that was put forward by the PC caucus, and I believe it could have saved a lot of the trouble that the government finds itself in, but that all Nova Scotians, including people in Shelburne, in Digby, in Yarmouth, in our Acadian communities, and the African Nova Scotian communities, they also would have been saved a lot of heartache, because not only would all three parties be making contributions, but they'd be a good watchdog on each other. This, Madam Speaker, I know Nova Scotians would understand and accept as a principle of fairness. However, that didn't happen, and I will point out that both the Liberals and the NDP voted against that improvement on the way that we set electoral boundaries in our province, and that set Nova Scotia down the sorry course that it has been on for the year since then. And so there is plenty of blame to go around on behalf of those two parties, the Liberals and the NDP, for the course that we are now on. Madam Speaker, having gotten their wish as a government by getting a mandate to pick a government-dominated committee to set the terms of reference with the backing of the Liberal Party, the NDP set about doing their work. And they did produce a draft terms of reference that was not the same as previous terms of reference in previous years has been. It included an important difference, and that is that notwithstanding the 25% allowable variance, that every riding, even the protected seats, the Acadian seats, the African Nova Scotia seat, must now also comply, which in effect, Madam Speaker, makes a mockery of the idea that they're protected. Although the NDP continues to promote the fiction that there's still some special status for those ridings. In fact, no such special status exists, because like every other riding, they have to comply with the 25% rule. Now, Madam Speaker, I will say at this point that there could be a very healthy debate about whether all ridings should fit within the variance, or whether for historical or community or cultural reasons we should continue with the protection that was offered to the Acadian Nova Scotians and the African Nova Scotians. But, Madam Speaker, that debate never took place. That was a decision of one party alone. That was a decision made under the dark of night. That was a decision made in an NDP back room. That was a decision made without any input from the people of Nova Scotia, whether they're in one of the protected seats or whether they're not in one of the protected seats. That was a decision made by a handful of people, all from one party, who saw the advantage to them of wiping out those seats. That was the danger in having an NDP-dominated committee of this House set the terms of reference for the independent commission. That, again, is where Nova Scotia started down the wrong path to drawing electoral boundaries, by allowing one party to write the terms of reference for an independent commission. But, Madam Speaker, that was just the start. Then, an independent commission of men and women from around Nova Scotia were given the impossible task of traveling the province, of listening to the views of Nova Scotians, and then writing their first interim report. And when that day came, that independent commission tabled their first interim report, they had a choice to make. Because they had heard from all Nova Scotians. They had heard many everyday Nova Scotians travel to the commission to report that they wanted their communities to be kept together. They wanted their municipal boundaries respected. They wanted Acadian communities to be lumped together to ensure a diversity of voices and languages in this House of Assembly. They wanted an African Nova Scotian community to be held together to ensure there's a diversity of views and opinion in this House of Assembly. They wanted to know that in addition to a strict parity of vote, that the House of Assembly reflected not just the majority of Nova Scotians, but all Nova Scotians. And they had a choice as a commission to go with what they knew the people wanted, or to go with the will of a handful of backroom NDP members who had written the terms of reference. The commission, I believe, Madam Speaker, did the right thing and wrote a report that reflected the opinions of the people of Nova Scotia. They wrote a report that respected the diversity of cultures and communities and peoples of Nova Scotia. They wrote a report that would show that this House of Assembly, which belongs to all Nova Scotians, would reflect in its composition all Nova Scotians. They wrote that report knowing the straitjacket that the terms of reference had put them in. They believed that they had found the room within the terms of reference to write a legitimate report because one of the terms said clearly they were instructed to be guided by the terms of reference. They did take the terms of reference as a guide as they were written to say and produce that first interim report. That is the one, Madam Speaker, that is the report of the Commission that truly reflected the views of Nova Scotians. But as we know, it turned out it didn't reflect the views of every Nova Scotian because the Attorney General, the Minister of Justice, the NDP Minister of Justice is one Nova Scotian who said no to that interim report. He said no to the interim report both verbally and then later in writing, that regardless of what they heard from the people of Nova Scotia in their travels, his opinion was going to prevail. And so, Madam Speaker, the Minister of Justice wrote them a letter rejecting their report and requiring them to come up with a whole new one. Now, perhaps, Mr. Speaker, we'll never know who else in the Cabinet agreed to that decision. It's hard to comprehend that the Minister of Justice would do that all by himself. And for that reason, every single member of the NDP Cabinet, the Premier, and every minister also has their signature on that letter from the Minister of Justice that said no to the voices of the communities of Nova Scotia, said no, we won't accept your opinion about how our boundaries should be drawn. You have to conform to our opinion as an NDP government. That was the effect of that letter. And so the commissioners went out again, Madam Speaker, and they wrote a second interim report, doing their best to fit into an even tighter straitjacket that the NDP had put them under. Keep in mind, this is supposed to be an independent commission, not a commission that's put in a straitjacket by one party, a truly independent commission. In fact, Madam Speaker, the Speaker of this House, in instructing the independent commission, wrote to them and told them that the instructions of this House, being the initial terms of reference, are the only and final instructions they can receive. Apparently, that didn't include the NDP Minister of Justice, who chose to put his own view ahead of the House of Assembly and ahead of the people of Nova Scotia when he struck down that first interim report. Even then, Madam Speaker, it would have been proper to come back to the House of Assembly and involve all three parties in a debate over whether the Commission's report met with the terms of reference of this House or didn't meet with the terms of reference of this House. We could have properly had that debate then, but that debate never happened because the NDP Minister of Justice and his colleagues on the government side, they didn't want that debate either. They didn't want a debate about the legitimacy of the protected seats. They made that decision in the back rooms of only their party. And they didn't want a debate about the terms of reference when the initial report came out. They made that decision somewhere within the inner sanctum of the NDP. Madam Speaker, here we are in the historic House of Assembly of the great province of Nova Scotia, where democracy was first brought to British North America. And we celebrate that. And I find it hard to believe that it's in Nova Scotia where antics as undemocratic, as dictatorial, as so contrary to the will of the people have been carried out when it comes to something as important as determining our electoral boundaries. Madam Speaker, and those are two examples. Now, we all know that the revised interim report identified Yarmouth as a seat that would need to be split in order to comply to the straitjacket terms of reference imposed by the Minister of Justice. But at least there was time then for the Commission to travel the province and gather the opinions of the people of Nova Scotia another time. And that included visiting the people of Yarmouth, who turned out in record numbers to say, no, that is not the right way to proceed to the Commission. And so the Commission reported for a third time, again, taking into account the views of the people that they had heard from, and tabled their final report. And as we so famously know now, that report splits up the county of Shelburne and also Digby. But unlike Yarmouth and all the other communities that got their say before, there was no mechanism by that time for the people in those parts of Nova Scotia to express their opinion. Even the very people who are most affected by it had no mechanism to have their say. But I will say this, Madam Speaker, the people of Shelburne found their mechanism on their own. They organized their own meeting, and they turned out by the hundreds. And I do want to commend the Mayor of Clark's Harbour, Lee Stoddard, and the other municipal leaders of the area, the Warden of Barrington, George Aljackal, and the other municipal leaders who came together to call the community of Barrington together to express their views. And I was very proud to be there that night as the representative of my party to hear what they had to say. And they spoke very passionately, Madam Speaker, about the community of Barrington and Shelburne County, how they are one community. Those that know the area reasonably well know they don't always get along with each other perfectly, but they are one community. In fact, as I know the member for Shelburne knows, one of the pastors in the area got up and spoke at that meeting in front of 300 people and compared the relationship of the people of Shelburne County and Barrington to a marriage. That it may not be a perfect marriage, that they may not always get along. Reverend Sean Hatfield was his name, but they have chosen to be together for generations. And like every other marriage, no one outside should be able to split them up. What they have created, to paraphrase a book that that pastor would know well, let no one else split up. That was the views of the people of Shelburne. But other than the few of us from this legislature that were there, even after that meeting, they had no opportunity to express their views to a committee of this House or to an independent commission. Now, of course, at least one good thing is going to come out of this. The Law Amendments Committee is actually going to travel to Shelburne and make that case. I was very pleased to make that suggestion, and I know it was a multi-party suggestion because the member for the area is very quick to agree to it, and so we are of like mind on that. I hear today from the member for Digby a very valid question. Well, Digby's facing the same situation. Well, why not do the same for the people of Digby County as are being done for the people of Shelburne County? What is the difference between those two situations, other than that one is represented by an NDP member and the other is not? Well, that is not a good reason to draw a distinction between which communities you hear from and which communities you refuse to hear from, Madam Speaker. Again, pointing to the great flaw in this manipulated process that we see by the government over this past year. Well, Madam Speaker, now we're at the point of no return. I don't know how the government, and it's clearly on their hands now, is going to unscramble the egg, is going to uncook the hot dog, is going to find a way to undo the damage that's been done. Because no matter what they do now, some community somewhere is going to have to pay the price. I don't want you to think about that hot dog example too much, Madam Speaker. Although much like a hot dog, the way that this government has gone about drawing the electoral boundaries, it's best that you not look inside. That's how bad it is. Well, Madam Speaker, I speak today not only as the member for Cumberland South or the leader of my party, but as a Nova Scotian who is very proud of the democratic history of our province, who is very proud of the communities that have come together to form Nova Scotia, Anglophone, Francophone, Mi'kmaq, African Nova Scotian, and on and on and on, and it grows to this day with Iranians and Muslims and Lebanese and on and on. And this great historic House of Assembly ought to reflect all of those voices in this chamber so that every Nova Scotian knows that they are truly a part of their province, that they are truly a part of the decision-making of their province. But as long as one party takes control of the drawing of the electoral boundaries and manipulates it so badly, Nova Scotia will not have realized that great, great democratic tradition that we are known for. And that's why, when this bill comes to a vote, because of this boondoggle, embarrassing process driven by that government, that we will be voting no. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I now recognize the honourable member for Digby-Annapolis.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to stand and speak on this bill. And I won't be long. I just want to make a few points, if I can, of what may happen, what's going to happen, and what has happened, I guess, first of all. But what has happened is, in April, the commission came to Tuscott and Clare and heard from those people, and then in August they went to Yarmouth and Clare, got together, and the message was very clear from all them communities, and the people from Clare were there saying, leave us alone, leave us where we are, leave us with our ridings. That's something that was given to us 175 years ago. We want to continue that and keep that. And then the commission even came to Annapolis County, or Annapolis, above Digby. And I believe then just after that, the final report came out. And lo and behold, here's a new riding in it of Clare and Digby. And the commission completely bypassed Digby, but went to other communities on each side of it to see how they felt. I went to the one in Yarmouth. I went to that meeting, and I went to the one in Annapolis. And I heard very clearly from the people of each side of that, Annapolis wanted the things to stay the way it was, and Yarmouth wanted things to stay the way it was. And I would say a good third of the people in Yarmouth, of the 2,500 people, were from Clare, because I looked at their flags that they proudly waved in that audience, and they said too, leave our riding alone. We've had this for 175 years, and I believe it was part of an agreement that was made after the deportation got over, which I want to get into my family background just for a bit. 15 generations ago, my forefather was from France, Jean Thériault. He came here in 1637, and he lived in the Clare area for up until 4 generations ago. And 4 generations ago, somehow they got by the deportation. They hid out well, I guess, and stuck around here and survived. And our family's still surviving. But 4 generations ago, my forefather, Gustave Thériault, came across St. Mary's Bay. They come over there in Petite Passage, they named it, 4 generations ago. They'd come over there and fish out of that passage in the summertime to catch their codfish and stuff for the winter. They dried them there. So in the meantime, when they was over there fishing, they'd row across St. Mary's Bay and fished out into the Bay of Fundy, which was out through that gap of Petite Passage. And while they was there catching their fish, I guess they got tangled up with my mother somehow. And that's good, and I'm glad that happened. The only thing I'm not glad that happened was, and I listened to the member from Argyll the other night, and he said he was pretty much in the same situation, but his father made sure that they kept their French language because they lived in the French community. But my forefather, Auguste, stayed in the English community, and our language died because our mother dominated over our language. And I've always felt bad for that. I never really learned to speak any French. When I went to school, they only taught us to count to 10. But now my grandchildren, now 5 and 6 years old, are nearly fluent French. And I thank God for that, and I thank the new system of our schools for that. But right now, with my background of being a Thériault and being 15 generations here, I'm worried of what's going to happen with Digby and Clare coming together. I truly worry about that because it's going to be nearly half French community and nearly half English community. And I mean, that kind of puts me in the middle because that's kind of where I am, I guess. My background, 8 generations of Irish, 15 generations of French. I argue with myself sometimes when no one's around. But I don't want to argue. I don't really like arguing with other people. I like using common sense. And common sense is a great thing. And I want to tell you how some people feel about this boundary change. I heard one person say to me, if this happens, the French community will come out in droves, which they always have when it comes to a vote for the people, that someone they want to represent them. They'll come out usually 80, 90%, but this time in that area, they'll come out 100% to make sure somebody from their community represents them. And where is that going to leave the other half of the English people who probably won't come out that strong to get a person to represent them from their people? I see a battle right there starting, you know, in that community. I heard another person say this is probably one of the worst things that could happen to us in the French community since the deportation. You know, they lost their right to be here. Now they're losing their right that I believe they made an agreement 175 years ago in 1837 to have that distinct society and be represented that way. And here they're losing that. So So I know just the way that man put it to me, how they are feeling. So it's going to be a battle right in the community, I believe, to get that person, some person, elected to represent the French and the English people. I can see it brewing, I can feel it brewing, and it hasn't even happened yet. You know, another fella told me, if you're a Star Trek fan, some of you may be, I mean, I am, I mean, yeah, a lot of people are, Star Trek. I mean, that's where the flip phones came from. I mean, from the first Star Trek, they had them back 30 years ago. Gene Roddenberry was he had quite a hit on his shoulder. And there was also another group in outer space called the Borg. And the Borg flew around in outer space, and any people they came across, they would try to simulate them to be like them, to absorb them. Resistance was futile. That's what they would say when they got you. You all know that. You know, I think some of the people in the French community are feeling the same way that they feel by breaking up their ridings, taking their ridings away from them, and putting them in with the English people. They feel that they're losing that distinction. They feel that they want to be simulated, just like my great-grandfather was 4 generations ago. He was simulated into the English community at no fault of his own. It just happened. We still love him, and the whole family loves him, and we know about him, but we lost that language by that happening, of what happened to my great-grandfather of 4 generations ago. Can that happen to the French communities of this province if we divide them up and bring them, if they lose their distinct part of their society, of what they fought for and what they've had for 175 years? Something to think about, I would say. And I know they're thinking about it because I've heard it. So with them few words, I think that's probably enough out of me about that. But I hope the government is listening over there. I hope the Premier's listening, because it would be a hard thing to live with for the next 175 years, realizing that you may have become a Borg and simulated the French people into the English society with maybe not even realizing it. So, something to think about. With that, Madam Chair, I'll take my seat.
Now recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, listening to my colleague from Indianapolis, it really said a lot about what we're supposed to be doing in this House. My uncle, who brought me in after my father passed away, he was a pretty practical guy. Not a whole lot of education, an awful lot of common sense. And he used to say time and time again, if it's not broken, why fix it? Here in the province of Nova Scotia, we have a system that has been working. We have people that are being represented. In Nova Scotia, one of the great things is nobody really looks around and says, what's your background? They just say, we're all Nova Scotians. And we need to be treated fairly. And we normally are. But now this process has come upon us. And it's not a process that any of us should be proud of. Our job here is to make sure that there is fair representation, to make sure that people get their voice heard. And in my time in being involved as a representative from Cape Breton West, never once, Madam Speaker, never once did anyone come to me and say, you know, in Richmond County, they only have 7,500 voters, and you have 14,000. Never once was that an issue. Why, Madam Speaker? Because there were a community of interest. There were interests of the people who lived in those areas, and they were getting represented because of those interests. So this process came along. And I know we have to review it. That's part of our mandate. And I think we should.
But just because you have to review a process, it doesn't mean that you have to change something that's working. Madam Speaker, we as a House elected a committee. That committee went out and listened to Nova Scotians. They came back. They had some suggestions. They selected a group of people, normal, everyday Nova Scotians, from every walk of life who had concerns about their community, who took on a volunteer position because they thought it was important to be involved. And what happened? They, in turn, went to community after community after community. They met with people. They listened to those people. And those people told them what they felt would be good for their community. So what happened next? This group came back with an interim report. A report that did indeed leave the 4 protected seats intact. It made some changes in some other areas. But there was a reason why these people, these volunteers, these people who have been active in their community came back with that report, Madam Speaker. It is because that's what they heard from the people around the province of Nova Scotia. And that was what we asked them to do. Now, when they issued their report, there was very little uprise. A lot of people thought it was a reasonable report and were ready to take it, except for the Minister of Justice. He didn't think that it was right. He didn't think they followed the mandate that was given to them. The mandate they were given was given to them by the people of the province of Nova Scotia, who went and spoke to them and told them what it was that they needed and what they wanted. That was the mandate that they followed, and that's the mandate that we're supposed to follow. Because this House that we're in today, the people that are in here representing the people of the province of Nova Scotia are supposed to be doing just that, bringing forward their ideas and their concerns, not what's best for an individual party or an individual person. We are given the trust to make sure that the wishes that they have made known to us are enacted upon. And we should all, every person in this House, be ashamed of how this process has taken place and how it has drifted away from the very mandate it was intended to do, to listen to the people of the province of Nova Scotia. You know, Madam Speaker, returning to the House of Assembly this session, the members of our caucus were very hopeful that we would spend our time talking about jobs and the economy, talking about families, talking about where we were going in this whole province, talking about things that I hear about every day when I'm in my constituency: power rates, education, health care. Those are the kind of things that I hear when I'm in the constituency of Cape Breton West. People are upset by the boundaries, but they throw up their hands and say, why do we bother talking? We go, we make our presentations, and nobody listens. Instead, what has happened, Madam Speaker, is we have had heavy-handed interference by this NDP government. What was supposed to be an independent process, a process to redraw the boundaries of this province, has been forced into an issue in this House. Madam Speaker, that is not what you do with an independent commission. Madam Speaker, anyone who's been following this process, who's been following it from day one, can see that there were flaws. From the time that there was that meeting just before Christmas, with another meeting just before New Year's, with members of the committee as far away as Bador, or as far away as Argyll, or as far away in different parts of this province, to call a meeting 2 days before family holidays to try to set the rules so they could fit in a box that suited one government place. Madam Speaker, that's not what the people of the province of Nova Scotia want, and that's not what they deserve to get. Madam Speaker, I want to make it perfectly clear that the people that served on that commission were good people. Good Nova Scotians who have been putting their names forward in many different ways at many different times, doing what they felt was good for the province of Nova Scotia. They did it time after time after time. They did their job. They went out. They listened to what people had to say. They brought back the thoughts of those people, and what happened to them? They were chastised. They were chastised by the Attorney General of the province of Nova Scotia. That is not the way it should have happened. That man is just that. He's a man, and he doesn't have that authority. He was overriding the authority of this whole building, of this whole house, of this whole system that we celebrated 250 years of democracy here in this province. He walked over what is the right way to do things in order to satisfy a few on that side of the house. There are very, very many great Nova Scotians. We had a sample of them with the people that were on this committee, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, and we walked over them. Even to the point when we had the final report come out and there was a dissenting vote. And what does the Premier of this province do? He runs them over. He chastises them for saying what he believes. I thought that was what a democracy is about saying what you believe and being able to say it and not have any repercussions. And here we are, 10 days away from Remembrance Day, where we want to be talking about many, many people who gave their lives so that we would have that right. And what does the Premier of this province do? He chastises an individual who had the spirit and the belief in his convictions to speak up for what he believed. Shame on him. Shame on him. Paul Gaudette is a very honorable individual, well known and well respected, not only in this community, but in many areas. And he is a name now that is recognized in many parts of this province because of the way he was treated by the Premier of this province. He deserves an apology from this Premier, that government, and this House. Now, Madam Speaker, historically, the redrawing of our electoral boundaries in Nova Scotia has been an apolitical affair. Now, granted, there have been instances where the results have left some people unhappy and disappointed. But prior to this year, prior to this set of reviews, no one could ever say that a sitting government interfered in the process for political purposes. Yet, Madam Speaker, that's exactly what the NDP government did here in the province of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, that's not acceptable. The last two times, Madam Speaker, that this was done, when the boundaries were drawn, the Progressive Conservative Party, our party, was in government, and every effort was made to ensure the process was fair and not political. That's true. Even the member for Richmond, who said sometimes is not always that kind to the Progressive Conservative Party, made the point last week. Here in this place, he said, "I don't believe," and I quote, "I don't believe you'll ever find where any member of the House would say there was a political interference in 1992 or in 2002. And I will table the honourable member for Richmond's comments in full, Madam Speaker. He's right, Madam Speaker. The member from Richmond is right about what about that. And in this caucus, we're proud of the fact that there was no political interference. At another point in his speech, the member for Richmond explained that since he's been around this place and the electoral boundaries process for a long time, which he has, he's a long-standing member here, a hard-working member, he offered some advice to the chair of the Select Committee, the Attorney General. The member for Richmond told us his goal was to be, and I quote, ensure we were able to do this in a fair, impartial manner, and as it was done the previous 2 times. And that is already in the document that I just tabled, Madam Speaker. What we have here is members of the Liberal caucus who rarely award any credit to the members of the Progressive Conservative Party, but acknowledging that historically our party has kept politics out of this process. Now, I hear a snicker coming from the member from Guysborough, Sheet Harbour.
He always finds a way to get himself in the...
But he really wants to be part of the discussion, and I'm hopeful that he's going to get on his feet.
It's not allowed.
If he's allowed.
A lot of time over there. You can see him in Harbour.
Now we hear from one of the sources of the wind energy from that side of the house.
When have you listened to what?
We're hearing now from the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage. The acting chair, by the way, who gerrymandered the meetings that brought this around. This man, Madam Speaker, this man is a political scientist. He spent much time telling the young people of our communities how politics worked in Nova Scotia. That's amazing. And then he takes part in a system that takes a system that was working and turns it around and twists it so that it suits one party in the House of Assembly. Shame on that individual, Madam Speaker. Shame on him. And you know what, Madam Speaker? I'm proud to say that our party continues to keep politics out of this process. In fact, our leader, the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, is the only leader in this place who refused to try and petition the Electoral Boundaries Commission. That was because he respected the independence of the process. You only need to look at how the process has unfolded to see how exactly this NDP government has put their own political interests ahead of what is best for the people of the province of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, a year ago, the NDP first revealed their plans to stack the Select Committee on Electoral Boundaries. As was said earlier, it happened here on Halloween. That night, we thought it was a good thing. We were moving on a process that had a proven track record. Little did we know that indeed it was only a Halloween trick that was being committed by the government of the province of Nova Scotia. This government, this NDP government, has interfered every step of the way. The NDP has interfered and intervened in ways unheard of by long-standing members of this House of Assembly, by anybody that has been a student of politics in the province of Nova Scotia. We remember when the Electoral Boundaries Commission first released their interim report. The Attorney General told them to go back to the drawing board. The report wasn't what he wanted. It wasn't what the NDP wanted. But it was what the people of the province of Nova Scotia wanted, Madam Speaker. After all, if you can't win a seat, it's just easy to get rid of it. It's easier. And that's what the Attorney General ordered the Commission to do. In short, the Attorney General decided he could treat Nova Scotians like some kind of an NDP banana republic where the government could draw the electoral boundaries any way they wanted. And that's not the way it should be in Nova Scotia. That's not the way it is in Nova Scotia. And that's why people came out in droves against what was being done to them in places like Yarmouth and Shelburne and other areas. But, Madam Speaker, apparently demanding a new interim report wasn't good enough for the NDP. That didn't satisfy them because they wanted to see something else unprecedented in the province of Nova Scotia. We saw members of the government. We saw cabinet ministers. We saw the Premier appearing before the Boundaries Commission and lobbying for changes. Never seen before. But this group decided that that's what they needed to do because it wasn't exactly working out the way they wanted. There was pushback from the very people that they're supposed to be representing. Now, I can't speak for you, Madam Speaker, or anyone else, but I know I didn't make a presentation to the Boundaries Commission. I know I didn't even do a written submission to the Boundaries Commission because it's the people that I represent that this process is for. And it was those people who made their presentations because that's how this system is to work, not to have people like the Premier going before the Commission and instilling their wishes on a group of volunteers who they wouldn't take their advice in the first place from. Madam Speaker, our caucus opposed the inappropriate political interference from the very beginning. And it's for that reason we find ourselves unable to support this legislation. And people will ask, Madam Speaker, they'll ask, well, what was the result of this heavy-handed political interference? Well, Madam Speaker, one result was the division of Shelburne. The first report that was prepared by the Electoral Boundaries Commission on the advice of Nova Scotians, and I want to keep going back to that. The Commission went out, they listened to Nova Scotians, they came back with a report. They did their job. They listened to the community, and as a result of that, Madam Speaker, that initial report was met with great praise from all parts of this province and how efficient a job they had done, how they had looked into and took into consideration concerns about communities of interest and minority situations that we've had in the past. The Commission did their job on that first report, and Shelburne was happy. Residents in the protected constituencies were happy. There were some issues, of course, but the members of this caucus, we were confident that in the second round of public consultations, the Boundaries Commission would get it right. And Madam Speaker, had they been left alone to do their job, they would have got it right. But no, what happens? The NDP stepped in and the Attorney General refused to accept the report. He ordered a new one that suited the NDP's liking. He took it from being about community of interest, about pride in community, and he turned it into a simple numbers game, a numbers game that hurt people right across this province. And it's amazing, Madam Speaker, it is truly amazing how one man can make every person in the province of Nova Scotia so upset by writing one silly letter that he had no business in writing in the first place. Madam Speaker, after the NDP's interference, and because they ordered the elimination of the protected constituency, the final report saw the constituency of Shelburne divided without any consultation. So what's the result of that? Here the Attorney General says, well, we're going to go down and we're going to have a meeting there so that the law amendments can hear what everybody has to say. But the members in our caucus who were on that committee weren't asked. The members in the Liberal caucus weren't asked. And then today, when my good colleague from Annapolis, Digby Annapolis, said, will you come to Digby Annapolis and will you listen to their concerns? All we heard from the Premier was, well, they can come to law amendments and they can have their turn there, and the best thing to do is get on with this so we can have the law amendments quick and so you can do what needs to be done. Again, strange that we have time to go to an NDP cabinet minister's constituency, but we don't have time to go to a constituency held by somebody in the opposition. And it was right. It was right for the member from Argyll, my caucus colleague, to urge the Law Amendments Committee to meet in Shelburne by a letter. But you know, what should have happened was the committee should have been called into place and a discussion take place. And at that discussion, decide as a group if that could take place. Madam Speaker, there are so many things that are wrong with this process. But the worst thing that I see is we forgot, or at least that side of the House has forgotten, why we're here. We're here to represent the people that gave us the opportunity to be here. I remember when I first got elected, the member from Cape Breton Nova, who was no longer in the House anymore, but was one of the longer sitting members, said to me, you know, when you look at it, it's pretty awesome, the honor that's been placed on you. When you look at how many people are in the province of Nova Scotia, and only 52 had the privilege to sit in this House. Think about that, Madam Speaker. And look around at all our colleagues from many different areas of the province, from many backgrounds, from many different interests, but all here with the single purpose of doing what they believe is best for the province of Nova Scotia. And then look at a group that decides they know better than everybody else. They know exactly what everybody needs to have happen. They know how to fix everything. I guess that's why we've lost 8,300 jobs. That's why pulp cutters in my community and around my community are wondering how they're going to survive and stay in business. That's why power rates have increased higher than they've been anywhere else, because they have all the answers. Well, if that's the answers they have, my goodness, that should be enough warning for them to look at what they're trying to do to the boundaries and to the people of the province of Nova Scotia. As my uncle said, if it's not broke, don't fix it. A man who had a lot of common sense, a man who made a nice living in this community, a man who is so much and so similar to many of the people that I have the privilege to represent. Madam Speaker, it is a crime, an outright crime, as to what that group are trying to do with the Boundaries Commission. It is out of place to think that they know better than anyone in the province of Nova Scotia, Madam Speaker. It is a shame that they think this is the only way they can win re-election, by gerrymandering rather than by giving good government. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Now recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I just want to go on the record here for a few moments. Much has been said about the boundary issue and what's happened surrounding this issue for the past number of months. And I really take exception to a couple of issues here. One is the fact that the Premier continuously states that or did state that the Law Amendments Committee decided to go to the constituency of the Minister of Fisheries, Shelburne, with the committee to discuss the concerns of the people of Shelburne. And I think that's a great idea. I don't have a problem with that, except, well, I have two problems with it. One is that the Law Amendments Committee never met and decided to go anywhere. That's number one. I'm a member of the Law Amendments Committee, and I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that I was never consulted about where the Law Amendments Committee was going to go with this issue. My colleague, the House Leader, was never consulted, and the two members from the Conservative Party were never consulted. This was done by one government place, the Premier, hastily trying to dose a fire, I guess, down in Shelburne County with his Minister of Fisheries, who was under siege down there. And so the Premier decided that he was going to tell the Justice Minister that committee is going to Shelburne. Well, I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that I'm a member of the committee, and I'm not going to Shelburne. Because if I go to Shelburne, I'll go everywhere else in Nova Scotia with this committee, that people who want to hear, the member from Antigonish wants the committee to go down there. The member from the members from the Acadian communities want the Law Amendments Committee to go there. Fair enough. If we're going to change the rules of this House, let's change it for everybody. Let's not cherry pick where this committee is going to go to try to save the hide of a government cabinet minister. Let's be honest about this and say that if there's enough concern with this report, then the Law Amendments Committee should go around this province and hear all of those concerns before they come back here and file their final report and report back to the House of Assembly. Madam Speaker, this is absolutely ridiculous. This is not democracy. This is the way this government's going to operate. Why do we have a Law Amendments Committee? Why don't we just have the Justice Minister and the Premier decide what's going to happen at Law Amendments, and the rest of us can just take our places here? We have no say. And I know that the reasonable thinking people would agree that at least the committee should meet and decide these issues at the committee level, knowing full well that the government has a majority on that committee and the government's going to get its way. That's fine, but at least we would have the ability to go before this committee and state our case as to whether or not we should go or we shouldn't go, and then watch the government do its will anyway. So democracy has gone out the window here. This majority NDP government is running the show, and the Premier is developing policy on the fly every day. If a crisis comes up, the Premier tries to put the fire out on a daily basis, only to have another fire the next day. Now the Minister of Transportation is encouraging his people in Antigonish, another cabinet minister, who was speaking freely and saying that the Law Amendments Committee should go to Antigonish, that the Law Amendments Committee should listen to the people of Antigonish. And I'm saying, Madam Speaker, that I agree with that as well. But I also agree that they should go to Digby, and the Premier, you know what the Premier said about the people of Digby today? Oh, they can come to Halifax and they can get in there and make their case. They can make their case. No thought about going to Digby, maybe because the member from Digby is not a cabinet minister. That could be, but they're not going to Antigonish yet either. We'll wait and see what happens there. I suggest that if the Minister of Transport can't get the Law Amendments Committee to go to Antigonish and it's going to Shelburne, then that minister should quit the government and sit as an MLA and represent the people that he sent here to represent. because his people have said they want the Law Amendments Committee to go to Antigonish. They want to be heard. So if that minister can't deliver that, he should resign from that cabinet and represent the people of Antigonish, because that's who sent him here, not the Premier. And the same goes for the other ridings, Madam Speaker. And I don't want to talk too long on this issue today because much has been said about it, but I can tell you that I, for one, as a member of that committee, I think my rights in this House have certainly been compromised. As a member of the committee, I have not even had the courtesy of the Justice Minister telling me what's going to happen. Never mentioned it to me. We heard it here in the House. He went out and told the press, and then the Premier said he did it first, and then he said, no, the Minister of Justice did it. And then he said the Law Amendments Committee did it. Well, the Law Amendments Committee didn't know anything. It never met. You know, so, I mean, what kind of democracy are we operating here anyway? But I want to, for a moment, go back to Cape Breton and the fact that this report is having the effect of losing another seat in Cape Breton. If this report goes through, Cape Bretoners are going to lose yet another seat. When I first came to this House, we had 11 seats in Cape Breton Island, the House of Assembly. If this report goes through, we'll have 8. We've lost 3 seats. And I suggest to you, Madam Speaker, that why the hurry for this report to go through anyway? Let's give it some more thought. And, you know, the good people of Cape Breton Nova, that seat is disappearing. The seat of the Speaker is disappearing if this report goes through. And, you know, the community of Whitney Pier is not going to disappear. I'm not going to stand here and say that the community of Whitney Pier is simply going to fade into history by the demise of the name Cape Breton Nova. What's going to happen here is that Cape Breton is going to lose one more voice in this House of Assembly representing that great part of Nova Scotia that I dearly love. And that doesn't seem to bother the government at all. That doesn't seem to bother the government. We have cabinet ministers who are trying desperately to save their own seats, but no thought about what I think would be a rational decision for this House to make, this entire House of Assembly to make. What's the hurry about putting this through? We're ahead of schedule on it anyway. Why not turf this report and go back to square one? First report. Because the report is compromised anyway. The report has been interfered with by the government. It wasn't an independent commission at the last of it. It was a gerrymandering of the worst kind by this government to suit its political will. That's all that's happening here. And do you think if the government thought for 1 minute that the Minister of Fisheries would survive if they didn't go down there, they would never send that committee down there. The fact is, the only way they're going to save his hide in this House is for to go down there. And, but I don't know what they're going to do after they listen to them, because it's going to have an effect going right across that part of Nova Scotia. The Premier says no changes. So if there's going to be no changes, why is the committee trotting on down there? You know, to have some kind of a circus there, you know, and then walk out of there and do nothing for the good people of Shelburne. And worse than that, Madam Speaker, they won't even commit to go to the Minister of Transportation's riding in Antigonish. So I guess they care less about him than they do about the Minister of Fisheries. That's the only thing reasonable Nova Scotians would suggest in that situation. But I say to both those cabinet ministers, represent your people first. Represent your people in your ridings first. And if you do that, you cabinet ministers may be around this House as long as I've been, if you represent the people that sent you here, and never mind listen to one government place. Because if you listen to one government place, you're surely going the way of your government, out the door after the next election. And the people of your ridings will say, thank heavens we got rid of them people because they wouldn't represent us the way they were sent here to do. Now, in conclusion, Madam Speaker, I just want to say, as a member of the committee, I've been a member of this committee for a long period of time. Never have I been party to this kind of shenanigans going on here to send a committee down around the province on some kind of a dog and pony show that doesn't mean anything. I think the people in the government party should tell the Premier and tell the Minister of Justice that they should turf this entire process and go back to square one with a truly independent commission that will do its work without interference from the government. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Now recognize the honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I realize that this boundary issue is one that has caused a lot of stress in communities across the province. It's caused a lot of stress with MLAs that represent those communities that have been impacted by it. It's something that impacts all sitting members. It's something that impacts Nova Scotians everywhere. And the gravity of this, I think, is well understood by everybody in this House of Assembly. I do want to address some of the what I would consider to be outlandish attacks on our leader and the attacks coming from the government side of the House, as well as the third party, saying that somehow Liberals are responsible for what's going on right now. There's been a quote used from our leader when he presented in Annapolis, which I will provide in a second, which is used out of context and misconstrued to try and cover basically for this government's ineptitude in dealing with this issue. In order to understand that, I'm going to table a table. I'm going to table a table here. This is table 1 of the Electoral Boundaries Commission. In this table, it lists the amount of electors, so the different populations in each current riding or constituency. If you note here, by looking at the data on this table, there were 5 constituencies in the southern part of Nova Scotia, on the South Shore and in the Valley, which are below the population requirements or electoral requirements that the NDP government has set forth in the terms of reference. Those 5 are Argyll, Clare, Digby-Annapolis, Queens, and Shelburne. And I'll table this table right here. The quote that's been used against our leader, and I'll read this now and I'll table it as well, Madam Chair. I know other solutions have been looked at by the Commission. I know that some others have been presented to you at meetings like this one, for example, like combining Clare and Argyll, or merging Argyll with the municipality of the District of Barrington, then combining Queens with the remaining of Shelburne County, and combining Clare with Digby. All of these would meet the population target set by the NDP government. Nowhere in this quote does our leader make a recommendation to the Electoral Boundaries Commission. He doesn't even come close to making a recommendation. What he highlights is the terms of reference, as the NDP have set out, provide certain electoral numbers that need to be fulfilled. And he basically repeated what it actually says in the Commission's report, and I'll highlight that later, that if you're going to look at the population numbers, as the NDP have commanded the Boundary Review Committee to do, then these are the options that the Commission is looking at, as set out by the NDP government, and I'll table this. And for some reason, this quote has been used to suggest that somehow the Liberal Party is responsible for this proposed split of Shelburne, which is absolutely ludicrous. It's unfounded, and it's quite shameful, actually, to see a government resort to these sorts of base tactics to divert attention away from the fact that they've actually created this mess in the first place. I was also disappointed with the third party, because for a long time during this process, both opposition parties stood united in our opposition to the way this electoral boundaries process had been dictated by this government. And there was a long time that we were both doing what we thought was right, standing up for minority representation, protecting those ridings, and ensuring that the voices of Nova Scotians were heard. And it was unfortunate that the third party decided to jump on the NDP bandwagon and try to pinpoint this issue on the leader. I think the fact that we see both parties doing this is just a clear example of who people in this House and the other two parties think the biggest threat is. And I would consider it a compliment, actually. Because if we're going to look at quotes, that were from people that presented during these Boundary Commission public consultations, I have one here. I believe that the proposal to split Shelburne County is a good one, and I quote this. I believe that the Clyde River boundary, or somewhere in that area, would make sense for that to go toward Queens County. Again, because of communities of interest, flow of traffic. Argyle and the other half of Shelburne could go that way, and it would make sense. And I'll table this quote. It's from the Boundaries Commission meeting held in Bridgewater, I believe, on August 14th. That quote comes from the Honourable Carolyn Bolivar-Getson, who is a former Conservative cabinet minister. So if we're going to use these quotes to suggest that, now am I going to sit here and say it's because of this former Tory cabinet minister that this boundary split happened? I'm not going to say that because it's not fair. You know, I'm not going to say that. And she actually said very specifically, this is a good idea, this is what we should do. Our leader didn't say that. I have another quote here if we want to take quotes out of context. This one isn't out of context. One of the other people that the New Democrats attacked and blamed for this split of Shelburne was Mark Fury, who I believe is seeking a nomination for the Liberal Party in Lunenburg West. I have a quote here from the member from Lunenburg West. And I quote, "The other thing is to acknowledge what many of the previous speakers have said." And this is, of course, I'm reading this because Mark Fury presented before the member from Lunenburg West. And Mark Fury is one of the guys that you know, the member for Shelburne has suggested is responsible for this split. So let's look here. "The other thing is to acknowledge what many of the previous speakers have said." This is the member from Lunenburg West. Mayor Down, Mr. Fury, and Mr. Noss, who was, I think, one of the longest-serving politicians in our country, not just in our area. The folks that spoke really do know the area well. Really do know the area well. Now, I will continue on with more quotes from the member from Lunenburg West as well. "For all those folks who live in Lunenburg County, but who were placed in the Queens constituency in the last review, and for all those in the current constituency of Lunenburg West, who, it is proposed, might be moved to the new constituency of Queens Lunenburg." So we see here that the member for Lunenburg West is I would say, adequately representing the interests of his constituents and saying we have a community of interest in the Bridgewater area. We want to amalgamate what was lost to Queens back into the Lunenburg constituency. I think that's a very fair thing to do as the member from Lunenburg West, because to have any communities divided, I think, is unfortunate. But when you take in consideration the data that I tabled earlier, the only way that that would work out is if Queens is paired with somebody else, because there's a population deficit there. Am I going to sit here and argue that the member from Lunenburg West is responsible for the division in Shelburne because he argued that the rest of Queens be put back into Lunenburg and you know, not directly, but the rest of Queens needs to go somewhere else? I'm not going to do that because it's not fair, and I'll table these comments as well. I'll table these as well. You know, so clearly you can take any quotes from any member of any party during this process and apply it in such a way that says, oh, someone's responsible for it. But really, quite frankly, it's the process itself that was responsible for this, and the population targets that were forced into these terms of reference by this government. The government right now is a majority government. No one else has power here. They're the only group of folks in this chamber that have power to do anything. And so for this group to suggest that it's everybody else's fault that this happened, I think is ridiculous. You know, I do have to address what the member for Shelburne said. You know, the member for Shelburne stood in his place, laid a pretty vicious attack on the Liberals, saying, oh, we're responsible for this. It's on the record. It's on the record. I've read the quote that's on the record. I read the quote that's on the record. And nowhere does it say, cut Shelburne in two. Nowhere did our leaders say that. So let's look at what the member for Shelburne has said. I've got a quote here. From, when is this? This is a quote from, I think, sometime in October after the final boundary report was submitted. And the member for Shelburne is quoted as saying, "It came out of the blue. I was blindsided. It came out of the blue in October and I was blindsided." He didn't know there was a potential split that could happen in Shelburne. I'll table these quotes. So if the member for Shelburne and the Minister of the Environment was so blindsided, I wonder why he didn't read the July 20th report which was the second interim report, where it says the Commission considered the following ways to attain at least 75% of the average number of voters in constituencies that include the voters of Clare and Argyll. Merge, number one, merge the constituency of Clare with the constituency of Digby-Annapolis. Merge the constituency, and second, merge the constituency of Argyll with the constituency of Shelburne. It says very clear in this report, which was presented on July 20th, that the split of Shelburne was a very real possibility. And I'll table this, this page of the report. I'll table this for the minister to see, since he didn't read the report. Okay, so say the minister didn't read the report. You know, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. He was blindsided. He didn't know this was a potential. Didn't know it was a possibility of happening because he didn't do his due diligence and read the report that came out, knowing that every area in our part of the province would be affected. Let's look at a quote here from the member from Queens. And this is from August 14th. This is a presentation. And the member from Queens says to the Boundaries Commission, this is from the August 14th meeting, where they're soliciting public feedback. And I guess it would be dependent on where the boundary was drawn into Shelburne. I have another quote here from the member from Queens. I'm not going to make recommendations to the committee where those boundaries should move, whether they should move toward the Shelburne area or whether they should move to where the committee has recommended them to move at this point in time. She doesn't make any recommendations. She doesn't say that they shouldn't go to Shelburne, but she does recognize that there could be a potential boundary shift in Shelburne. So let's give the minister the benefit of the doubt. He didn't read the report. He didn't do his job, and he didn't read the report. Okay. But then why would a member of his own caucus know that this was a potential, and not him, the individual who represents Shelburne County? How, then, in October, is this member blindsided? Did the members of his caucus not share with him the fact that they were talking about potential shifts into Shelburne? You know, what's happening here? And so, I feel I'm sympathetic toward the member for Shelburne because I went through and might go through again the same issue he's going through with my community being torn in half, which is fair. And the same goes for every Acadian member of this legislature. I'm going to table these comments, please. But what I didn't appreciate was the fact that this minister, in a really desperate way, tried to pin this on individuals that had nothing to do with this. Absolutely nothing to do with it. You know, it's either that his caucus members were hiding this information from him and hiding the report from him, or he fell asleep at the wheel. You know, either way, the responsibility to represent our constituencies to the best of our ability falls on our shoulders and our shoulders alone. I don't ask anyone else in this chamber to represent Yarmouth. And no one should be expected to represent the constituents of Shelburne besides the member for Shelburne and the Minister of our Environment. But I am happy to see, I've had some feedback from Shelburne, that the community of Shelburne isn't buying this, this recent play by the NDP government, which is being supported by the third party. And I'll have a quote here from a constituent from Shelburne. Regardless, the NDP is evidently ready to attack the Liberals for putting this all in motion and then flip-flopping and covering up the fact that they recommended this in the first place. Classic Harper-style spin. The NDP can't be allowed to split up a county and simply blame someone else. So I'm very happy to know that constituents of Shelburne are actually aware of what happened and why this was happening in the first place. So let's look at this, this process from the beginning. You know, we've had members stand up, including the new Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage, and say, this is about voter parity, it's about equity, it's about fairness in our democracy. It's about ensuring that people are represented in the best way possible so that our democracy can flourish. Yet we set up terms of reference for a commission in secret right before Christmas. And when I say we, I mean I'm speaking in the whatever person for the government. The government, you know, speaking, the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage stands up and says this is about ensuring fair democracy. Yet we totally neglected to include other parties in that process. through a process by which they're meant to be included and they're supposed to be included. This is a unilateral decision made by one party, one member, to change the terms of reference of this Electoral Boundaries Commission. And that has resulted, I think, you know, since I've been around, and probably the last generation, in one of the moves that has hurt communities more than anything else in the province of Nova Scotia. And so, what happened to the member for Halifax Citadel after he did this as deputy chair of that committee? He was appointed as Minister of Communities, Culture, and Heritage. Communities, Culture, and Heritage. And that's the individual that set up a process. And I know it wasn't him. This is nothing from this government comes from anywhere but government one place, I'm sure. But he's the one that did it. He was the instrument. So you have a member, the member from Halifax Citadel, who unilaterally makes a change in the terms of reference for a very important process, the Electoral Boundaries Commission, a decision by which we eliminate protected Acadian ridings and tear other communities in two. And now this minister is responsible for communities, culture, and heritage in the province of Nova Scotia. There's been no person that has done more damage to communities, that has taken away our culture and our heritage as much as that member in this government. And that's the post that he now holds. That's scary to me. And I really think that the irony of all this, you know, especially hearing that member get up and speak about the nature of democracy and, you know, we need to include everybody, everyone needs to be treated fairly or equally. The irony of this is that we've actually set up a process that was completely unresponsive to the wishes of Nova Scotians. We put a commission in place with terms of reference that says, you know, you cannot have protected ridings anymore. Most members of that commission felt the same way. They shared the opinion of government going out into the field and consulting Nova Scotians. I know for a fact that many of them were determined to do what they thought was the right thing and eliminate protected ridings. But what happened, Madam Chair, is after these individuals, these volunteers, went out and consulted with Nova Scotians, they met with Nova Scotians from across the province, from Cape Breton down to Argyll and Clare during that part of the process. They said, you know what? It's wrong to eliminate those because they're actually important to our democratic representation in this province. Because to eliminate those would negatively impact the lives of many citizens. It would do damage to our ability to preserve and honor and to thrive our Acadian populations and culture. They came back with a very clear message. Protected ridings should stay because people want them and they're important. So we hear that this is about creating a fair democracy, an equitable democracy. But after that report came out, what happened? The Premier and the Attorney General said, no, we don't care what everybody said. We don't care what the consultations told you. We want you to do something else. And this is in pursuit of fair and equitable democracy? I know the member for Halifax Citadel is a political science professor. My first course in St. Mary's was with him. And I've always respected that member. But I know that he knows that democracy is a lot more complicated than a math formula. Our democratic representation is a lot more complicated than a math formula. And we learned that during the first process of this Boundaries Commission when these volunteers went out and talked to people. And we're still learning about it now. We're having communities ripped in two. We're having people feel hurt and neglected throughout this. But yet we still say democracy is only a math formula? It's not, Madam Chair, and I hope that all the members over there know it. When it comes to minority representation, there is a reason why you give special rights to minorities. Because without those rights, they aren't heard because they're not the majority. That's why these things happen. That's why there's protected seats in Nova Scotia, to give minorities a voice. A real one, one that sits in this House and can debate things and help make decisions. Having these special representative seats for these minority groups, especially ones as historic and important to this province as our Acadian population, our African Nova Scotian population, is an important part of our democracy. And I would say eliminating these is not in the interest of equitable democracy, because what it does is it ensures that the majority and only the majority have a voice here. And you look around this chamber and you see what that looks like. You know, we are becoming a more diverse House of Assembly as we move forward, but we're not diverse enough. You know, a lot of us share the same cultural heritage, the same racial heritage. And I think as a House of Assembly, we have an obligation to ensure that that's different, that all kinds of voices are represented in here. And the reason why you have protected ridings for minorities is because so those minorities can actually choose their representation and have a seat in this honored chamber with everybody else. And I would argue, this caucus has argued along with a third party, that in order to have real equitable representation that's fair, that's reflective of the complexity of our democracy, you need to give special rights to certain groups. That's the only way to level the playing field. And in the case of Acadians, it's a necessary component to preserve, protect their language, culture, and identity, which is very different from Anglophone Nova Scotians. It is different. It's a different history. It's a different culture. They're a different people. And it's just unbelievable to see, you know, a government that has professed to be such a progressive movement do something like this to minority groups. And so why would we do this? You know, everyone's going to speculate on the reasons why. Did the New Democrats run in their last election on eliminating minority ridings, protected ridings? Was there an outcry from the public to eliminate these? Were people in Halifax assembling saying, we're not being treated fairly because there's protected ridings, 4 of them out of 52, in southwestern Nova Scotia and in Cape Breton? So where does the motivation come from? There was no outcry, there was no protest to eliminate these protected ridings. But yet eliminating them is in pursuit of good governance and appropriate, equitable, fair democracy? What about the other side? Because there actually were assemblies. There actually were protests. There actually were movements to preserve these things. In Yarmouth, we had 2,500 people show up, the largest public gathering in Nova Scotian history when it comes to government policy. In Clare, we had 500 the first time, I think 300 the second time. In Argyle, we had over 200. We had more in Richmond. And the message from all those meetings was the same. In Yarmouth, we said we want to keep our riding together, obviously. We're a community of interest. We want to stick together. There was another message that night, one that would have been felt very clearly by anybody in that room. We want our neighbors to have a voice too. We want our minorities to be protected. We want our protected ridings to remain protected. Where was the response to that? Where was a response to some of the largest political movements that there has been in the last decade to change something? There was none. This government was totally unresponsive to movements of people and to the wishes of people. And I think it's very, very unfortunate that they've allowed to do this under the guise that this is for better democracy for everybody. Trust us. You know, don't trust yourselves. We know what's best. You know, the Acadians, yeah, of course they want representation. But that's not right. Because the only thing that matters is voter parity. We know that's not true. And the members that I'm hearing on this side of the House bring up a very good point. When it comes back to the motivations to eliminate these, if it didn't come from the public, if it wasn't promised in your election platform, if it didn't really come from anywhere besides some meeting that the member for Halifax Citadel, the now Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage, and the Premier, you know, came from 2 people, probably, or maybe a few others in that caucus, I don't know. But if it didn't come from these public, from a public will, then where did it come from? And I'm not leveling any accusations here, but when one looks at the fact that no NDP representative has ever been elected in any one of those protected ridings, something I think now they're very proud of, perhaps we have a bit of political interference and influence coming to this for political gain. So let's look at who. So the question I guess you always have to ask when it comes to looking at motivations is who's going to benefit the most? The most logical way to look at motivations, who's going to benefit the most? I can understand where the Premier is coming from. We get rid of 4 seats that we'll never have, and we'll get more seats in Halifax where we're stronger. Clearly, the governing party had the most to benefit from this, and I think one can only assume that the reason for this whole fiasco is because they were trying to improve their political position in the province of Nova Scotia. And I think that's it's pretty shameful. Members of the third party mentioned that, and I've heard this from members of our caucus that have been around for a while. Never before has this process been set up in such a clandestine way. Never before has government involved themselves so much in this process without consultation with the other parties. The last time this happened, I believe, was under the Honourable John Ham, who was Premier. According to members that were around the table at that time, and I'm sure there were members from the NDP there as well, the Premier actually at the time wanted consensus amongst the parties on what the terms of reference would be for boundaries. He wanted consensus. Because that's fair. These boundaries affect everybody, and they should not be interfered because they're so important by the desire of one political party alone, who is self-interested. Premier Ham said we're going to include everybody, we're all going to agree on these terms of reference, and that's how we're going to move forward. And what happened when that was the case? Protected ridings were kept. So to have a government, and who under the guise says they're in pursuit of fair democracy in the province of Nova Scotia, not include the other party. Not even worse than that. It wasn't just not including the other parties. It was doing something without telling them. The only reason we picked up on this is because the members in the opposition parties picked up on the change in the wording in that document. Not only were we not included, we weren't told that it was going to happen. Right? Does that make sense to anybody? And that started this whole fiasco. You know, and it's been pretty shameful. And, you know, the Premier has had a very clear agenda to eliminate protected ridings. That's been laid very clear throughout this process. And I also have some quotes here from the Premier, and I'll just table them. But for the first time, I think, ever in Nova Scotian history, a Premier presented to the Electoral Boundaries Commission and pushed to eliminate protected ridings. And I'll table these comments right here. They're used, you know, the language that's used is legal jargon, but for anybody that can understand that, you know what he's talking about. He talks about deviation of population. And, you know, why this agenda? And then after the whole process was done, we have a commission member who's an Acadian, who was appointed by the Liberal caucus, our one appointee, who disagreed with what had happened. That's a surprise to anybody? An Acadian who's, you know, the future of their political representations in question, and he doesn't agree with it? Come on. Obviously, that's going to happen. But instead of being the statesman that sometimes we all hope our Premier will be, you know, we disagree in this House. You know, we get emotional and say things to each other, but at the heart of it, the Premier's the Premier, and he needs to be the representative of everybody in this province, not just his party. Not just his party. A Premier represents everybody. And this Premier, instead of being a statesman, instead of accepting the criticism of one of the commission members for what it was, a very fair, articulate criticism that was well warranted, what does this Premier say to that commission member who volunteered all of his time over the course of these last number of months in a very stressful situation, doing it because he was asked to? What does he say to him? He calls him a troublemaker. Says, oh, he's just been causing trouble from the beginning. Really? Is that what we want of our Premier? Does that party not demand more from the person that's leading you and that's leading our province? You know, I've even learned, I'm a backbench opposition MLA.
And a good one.
Thank you. I've learned you can't just shoot from the hip and say what you always want to say sometimes.
When you start.
It's been a very humbling experience for me to learn that.
Since when?
And the Premier can't. I still haven't quite learned it. I'm getting better. I'm getting better. But I'm not the Premier, so I get a little bit of leeway with what I say. But for the Premier to say these things, I really think it was a blight on his administration and a real clear view into how he thinks about things and how he feels about minorities in the province. And it was really quite shameful. So if anyone remembers, earlier during this process, after the first interim report was released, Dr. Jill Grant quit because she wanted to eliminate protected ridings. She left. She had a dissenting opinion and said, I'm not even going to be a part of this anymore. I'm going to leave. Did the Premier scold her? She was an NDP appointee, by the way. Did the Premier say, she's a troublemaker, she's just on there to cause trouble? No, you never heard it. But the gentleman who actually sat on that commission and endured all of this mess and tried to do his best to represent the principles that he believes in was chastised after. Clearly, it wasn't about anyone being a troublemaker. It was about the Premier not being able to handle criticism, which is symptomatic with that caucus over there, to be honest. I want to go back and talk about the meeting that we had in Yarmouth. It was a very, very powerful moment in the history of our community, and anyone that was there can attest to it. I know we had members from the two opposition parties there, one of whom presented. But in mid-August, August 13th, mid-August, everybody's supposed to be away on vacation and forgetting about all their problems. In mid-August, with only a 3-week notice, over 2,500 citizens congregated together in the Yarmouth Mariner Centre. In mid-August. That's how engaged the citizens are on this issue. And to be the member from that area, I just can't tell you how proud I was. I honestly can't tell you how proud I was of the people that showed up, of the folks that presented, of the volunteers that helped organize to get people out to that meeting. And I think it was a really telling moment for our community where we all came together for one reason: to protect the status quo, to ensure that people in Yarmouth had a united voice to be represented fairly in this House of Assembly, and to ensure that our Acadian neighbours in Clare, Argyll, and our distant cousins in Richmond and in Preston had a fair say as well. And part of that request was ignored. Not because the Commission didn't want to listen to us. I know that for a fact. They made it very clear, our hands are tied. Our hands are tied. That's what Dr. McNeil said. Our hands are tied. We have to change something. We can't keep the status quo. No matter what you say, no matter how many people say it, no matter how many people this hurts, no matter what it does to damage the representation of this House of Assembly, our hands are tied. Those are telling words, Madam Chair. Telling words. Especially from the chairperson of a commission that was supposedly independent. Independent. An independent commission said their hands were tied. And we all know why the reason is for that. It's not because of anybody on this side of the House. The opposition parties have stood steadfast in their opposition to how this has been handled by the government. And we've stood steadfast in our desire to have our minority ridings protected. It's because of the heavy-handedness of this government, because of their willingness to put their own political agenda ahead of the interests of Nova Scotians and force an independent commission to do what they wanted to do. Their hands were tied. Their hands were tied. Everybody should have been worried about that. There should have been outcry across the province to have an independent commission whose hands were tied. And that has resulted in what we have today. That's right. Minorities who have had long-standing representation in this House of Assembly, who have been protected by the majority. We've had their rights stripped. We've had their representation put into jeopardy. And we also have communities like Yarmouth and now Shelburne, Antigonish, Digby, who are affected as well. Communities being torn apart or amalgamated with communities that might not necessarily have much in common in terms of shared culture and identity and the economy for that matter. That's right. And it's all because of the terms of reference that were put in place on Christmas Eve by the member for Halifax, Citadel, Sable Island, no doubt at the orders of the Premier, and that has thrown us all into this mess where communities are being impacted everywhere. And I think it's a very, very shameful thing that's happened here, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker. Say it again. And to have, the member for Shelburne, the NDP caucus, and other people say that somehow this is the responsibility of someone else is ludicrous. The only reason we're here today is because of the government and because of their willingness to actually get involved in something they shouldn't have been involved in to begin with, for their own political gain. Simple, plain and simple. Right. And democracy has suffered as a result. Right. Our democratic representation in this House of Assembly has suffered as a result. Acadians and African Nova Scotians, those protected ridings, have suffered because of this. Why did they object the last 2001? Yeah. And this is an interesting fact too, Madam Speaker, which was this is just brought to my attention. Not only did the NDP not run on eliminating protected ridings, they actually supported them in 2001, the last time this happened. They actually supported it. They actually supported it. In 2001, there were no objections to the protected ridings by that caucus. Yet 10 years later, without telling anybody they were going to do it, they then decide to attack these ridings and eliminate minority representation in the House of Assembly. And, it's quite telling, I think, about how this government has operated. Because this government did stand for a lot of things in opposition. Right. Things that I supported as a student advocate and leader. Affordable, high-quality, accessible post-secondary education. A strong public education system. An opposition to corporate welfare and use of government funds to bail out large companies. Protection of minority ridings. In opposition, that's what this party stood for. Why now that they're in government do they do the exact opposite? As the member for Argyle said yesterday, a lot of former NDPers are saying, that's not my NDP. That's not my NDP. That's not what I signed up for. It's not what anybody signed up for. You didn't tell anybody you're going to do this. No one signed up for this. Right. And I really do think that this is going to be a real serious black spot on the record of this government. It's going to be interesting to see how they handle this. As the member for Digby-Annapolis mentioned, the Premier, because his cabinet minister's seat's in question, is willing to bring the Law Amendments Committee to Shelburne, which I think is a good thing, and our party supports that. But why are we only picking one community that's been affected when there's been other ones that haven't been heard? Digby hasn't been heard. The residents of Digby haven't had a meeting with the Electoral Boundaries Commission. And the Premier said today, nor will they have a meeting with the law amendments. So why only Shelburne? Why not Harbour-Boucher? Why not Digby? Why not anywhere else that's been affected? Cape Breton-Nova? I don't know. I guess people just have to speculate on that, Madam Speaker. But, you know, in closing, again, this is something, I think, that will be a very, very serious mark on this government's record. It's going to be one that has actually regressed our democratic representation. It's one that has angered a lot of Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other. And, Madam Speaker, I know it's one that this government, when we go to the polls, is going to pay for. Thank you very much.
Now recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm probably the newest member of this legislature here, running on the newest member, not new, the newest member, pardon me. It was only a year ago that I ran in the great community of Cape Breton North, and I'm fortunate to be the representative of the fine people there. And when I ran, Madam Speaker, I ran on a specific set of boundaries. So after I'm in for a little while, I hear about a new review that's going to take place. And Madam Speaker, when the first review came out, I inherited an area of Cape Breton South, in the westbound area. Madam Speaker, that gives me about 2,500 more voters in my constituency, which I'll be happy to take if it is that ends up that way. But in saying that, the people in westbound Cox Heath area have a different area interest than the people on the north side. They would do their banking in Sydney. They would go to school on that side of the water. They do with entertainment there. I spoke to a few people in that constituency, and not one of them ever said to me that they just get up and take a drive to North Sydney to get a hamburger. There's no theatre there. They don't go to a hockey game there. And when I heard the first report come out, I heard that the protected ridings were saved. And in saying that, I never once heard that that was a bad thing. There were some changes to some of the boundaries in some of the constituencies, but it didn't seem like it was that bad. But then it comes back, and then we hear that they didn't follow the terms of reference. So they have to go back to the drawing board. And I sat in on on at least 2 of the hearings, and not once did I hear that they should eliminate the protected boundaries. I heard of ways they should divide different boundaries up. And then I hear voter parity. Madam Speaker, one vote, one person, that probably works in a city. But how can you tell somebody in the riding of Victoria the Lakes that lives down in Ingonish area that has difficult access to his MLA if he has to go down and look at a road or deal with an education issue? It takes him 2 hours to get there. And how does that confirm the voter parity? Well, Guysborough is a huge riding, huge constituency. And I'm sure the member there wouldn't be happy if he had to take on more because the numbers had to go up. And after we seen the second report, where they divided places like Yarmouth, again, you have areas of interest that get divided. And, Madam Speaker, I just don't understand why you could take one community and divide it just on the basis of pure voter numbers. Madam Speaker, we heard it all over the province. Areas of interest and communities of interest should stay together. And if you kept the protected ridings, those protected ridings had a common interest. Yes, some of us had to gain a bit more, but it wasn't done in a way that we couldn't represent the people that we were meant to represent. And I look at this, Madam Speaker, somewhat like I played a lot of hockey in my day, and I spent a lot of time in the penalty box. And when I hear I could never go back to the referee, or I could never go back to the referee in charge and say, you know what, I don't agree with his call, kind of reverse it for me. Referees are given the rules to play by. They go by those rules. The select committee was given rules to go by, and to the best of their knowledge, they went by those rules. They listened to the people of Nova Scotia, and they come back with a report. And when they come back with that report, we heard that wasn't good enough. And Madam Speaker, we in Cape Breton are going to lose one constituency. And by losing that constituency, we feel we may lose a good representative in this area. When it comes right down to it, the honour of being an MLA is about representing the people you're elected by. And Madam Speaker, I'm pretty proud to be one of the 52, as a former speaker today from Cape Breton West said. It's quite an honour to represent the people from Cape Breton North and be one of the 52 in this House of Assembly. It's a real privilege. You know, we put in the hands of the Select Boundaries Committee, we put quite a task in their hands. And they went around the province and they listened to the people of Nova Scotia. And from what I could see, they were quite interested in what the people of Nova Scotia had to say. They listened, and they listened well, and they made a decision. And the people on that committee were then told that that decision wasn't proper. If the people of my constituency come to me and want me to bring something up in this House of Assembly or within my caucus, I make sure I do that. The people of this select committee, they did what they heard from the people of Nova Scotia, and that wasn't good enough. And I'm sure the people that we all represent in our constituencies, although we might not get the answer we want to hear, they're quite happy when we bring them back an answer, that we've at least tried, we've done our best to represent the people in our fine communities. So I ask the question, is voter parity the only thing that matters? One vote, one person? Madam Speaker, I can't see where a person who has a constituency in Halifax that can walk his constituency in 15 minutes but has a huge number of voters can represent his people, or how we in the rural areas that have huge geographic constituencies can represent our people like he can represent his. I don't think it's fair to say that sheer numbers is the way to go. There are completely different issues in the city than there are in rural Nova Scotia. People living in the city don't have road issues. They don't have a lot of housing issues. They don't have volunteer fire departments. They don't have schools in the numbers that we in the rural areas in a huge geographical area have to deal with. So a lot of our day is taken up dealing with the issues that arrive because it's rural Nova Scotia. You have to drive to those areas. You can't walk to the school that's in Neils Harbour if you're Victoria Lakes. I won't be able to walk to the school that's in Coxheath to deal with an issue that may come up. To get there takes time, and that takes time away from the office work that we have to do to be the representative of the people we represent. So to say sheer numbers is what we call voter parity, I have to argue that. Because for us to represent a smaller number of people is a lot harder than someone in the city to represent a larger number of people. When you go door to door in a large community, a large constituency, it takes its toll on you. To go to 13,000 or 14,000 people in the city where you get 500 or 600 people living in one apartment building, I would argue that that's a little easier when you don't have to reach out and go in different areas and drive and make sure you have someone to drive you there to pick you up. Because when you do that and you have miles between houses and you want to make sure you represent all the people, so you want to represent those people by getting to their door, hearing what they have to say. And when you hear what they have to say, not once did I hear anybody say anything about having protected ridings is a bad thing in the province of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, I just had to voice my opinion on those few little points so that the people in the larger ridings would understand that representing people in the province of Nova Scotia is not just one vote, one person. Voter parity to me is making sure that all the people get represented, and they get represented well enough so that everybody has their voice heard in this legislature. And by having the protected ridings, the Francophones and the African Nova Scotians have the opportunity to have that vote, to have that representation, and to increase the size of some of the constituencies, because of the numbers in Halifax have improved, and that the people here in Halifax will get a couple of extra constituencies. I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's fair to the people of rural Nova Scotia. I don't think it's fair to the MLAs that represent those areas in rural Nova Scotia. And with those few words, Madam Speaker, I'll take my seat, but I move to adjourn debate on Bill 94 for today.
Thank you. The motion is to adjourn debate on Bill number 94. All in favour say aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried. I now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. I wish you to now rise to meet from the hours of 9 a.m. to 12 noon, and after the daily routine, we will be doing government bills for a second reading, Bill 94, 97, 102, 105, 107, 109, 110, 111, and just reply if we got the time. So I wish we to now rise, Madam Speaker, again to be at the hours of 9 a.m. to 12 noon.
The motion is that we do now rise to meet again tomorrow, November the 2nd, between the hours of 9 a.m. and 12 noon. All in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried. It's now the moment of interruption, and I now call under Rule 5.5, as read earlier today, resolution put forward by the Honourable Member for Cape Breton West. And it reads, therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly commit to making... Order, please. I can't even hear myself talking. I'll start again. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly commit to making life affordable for Nova Scotians and urge the government to reverse their expensive policies so fewer adults will have to make that decision and fewer children will need to rely on food banks to eat. I now recognize the Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to speak for a short while this evening on tonight's topic, and I'll say it again, Madam Speaker. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly commit to making life affordable for Nova Scotians and urge the government to reverse their expensive policies so fewer adults will have to make that decision and fewer children will need to rely on food banks to eat. You know,